Hey, welcome back.
Hi, so glad you're here.
All right, so this week we will jump into cultural context, and then it's a little bit similar to what we did last week.
It is similar. So what's the difference, Troy, between historical context that we kind of looked at last week and cultural context?
And we get to see why cultural context is so important right here in chapter 8 of Acts. And the difference here is because we jump into a story and we see that they're being scattered all over. And the reason is, if you look just one chapter before, this guy named Stephen is persecuted, who is doing a lot of things for the movement, and this sparks this kind of chaotic fear. And so everyone is just being spread out, and it starts in Jerusalem. And then Scott's going to talk a little bit about the map and why this is important and why we should know a little bit.
Yeah, so the historical context is the first persecution happened with Stephen. People are scattering. What's going to happen to the gospel message? And we see that in the chapter leading up. And then what we see culturally happening is Philip begins to go north, and he goes into the region of Samaria, which actually harkens back to Acts chapter 1, where it says, "You'll be my witnesses, and you will go into Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." And so we begin to see that play out here because he goes north in that region. You almost need a map, because when you see these cities on a page, you don't quite know what's going on. But so he begins to travel north. We see the gospel begin to spread to these people, the Samaritans. And that was like, they were the half-breeds. But so what is God doing here? And then you see in chapter 8, Philip goes south, and it talks about he's on this road between Gaza and Jerusalem and what's going on there. And so really you have from Ethiopia, from Africa, there's this major trade route that Israel was actually the connection point between what would become like, modern day Europe, but more like Turkey, and you have all these places, and then you have Africa, and Israel is the trade route that goes through. And so this is the main road that we're talking on that Luke here is describing. And what we see again is that there's this Ethiopian eunuch who is coming down from worshiping. Context is fascinating to understand some of the depths that's happening here. So we have a guy from Ethiopia who is not inherently Jewish, but he's worshiping in Jerusalem, and that tells us either one of two things is happening. Either he had full-on converted into Jerusalem, into a Jew, and that would involve the process of believing in God as one, based out of Deuteronomy, and actually being circumcised to be part of that process, or in the very least, if he wasn't circumcised, to go through this process of committing to the Jewish belief system. If you look in context of the African nations that were around, they had a theology that had multiple gods, and there was almost this pagan roots that go through some of those traditions. And so you see this Ethiopian eunuch wanting a singular God experience and recognizing that. So there's the starting point to understand that this guy is recognizing that there's something different happening with the God of the Jews. And then in coming down, as he's reading Isaiah, you then have Philip begin to ask him and engage in this question of what this passage in Isaiah is about and who it's foretelling, which is about Jesus. The other interesting thing culturally is I think in the title, Ethiopian eunuch, oftentimes there's associations with eunuch, and what does that mean, especially as it relates to his body parts and what happens to that. And there's a lot of questions about that. We have some information for you on it in the guide, but more specifically, what I think the key information here as we get culturally is that he was of high status and an official. And so this really paints a picture of someone who has very high status in Ethiopia, and Philip, who's just this random dude. And then they enter into a conversation together. And I think that is where the beauty of the theology comes into play, where you have all of these dynamics in the story happening around, which influences the social scenario of what's about to happen. And then they begin to interact. And that's where the theology and the beauty really, I think, comes alive.
Yeah, and exactly on that beauty of the cultural context of knowing the status and the different personality or the different characteristics of both of these people in the story. And so that's why when you see Philip being invited into his chariot to explain to him what he is reading, there's a level of humility and vulnerability that the Ethiopian eunuch is taking on right there, because one, the status and the cultural, what Scott just explained to us, but then just the ability to say, hey, what am I reading? How would I know what I'm reading if someone weren't to tell me? And so that's just a beautiful example of humility, and why it's so explicit here is because of the status difference and just the vast canyons of in between who these people were and the likelihood of them talking to each other. And so that is why the cultural context just exposes so much of the scripture for us, and I think we can extrapolate this application that is so relevant for us, and that we just taking time to evaluate our hearts and just really, am I humble enough to learn from someone? And I just love that last week we talked about, Chap talked about children, and it makes me think like, man, am I humble enough to learn something from someone who's younger than me? And in this story, the eunuch just takes on a posture of humility and learning from someone who should have never been in that chariot with him.
So in the guide, there's going to be some questions that with this information, we're going to kind of work backwards and phrase the questions that you should be thinking about, because the hope is that you can learn this idea of thinking as it relates to cultural context and apply that to other passage. And so we're going to practice leaning into some of those questions, but hopefully the idea of the questions and what we're asking can become, in some regards, like a template for when there's unique things that come up in Scripture. Why is this guy from Ethiopia? That's unique. Why is he called a eunuch? That's unique. What's the reason for them going through the names of the streets and all those things? Those types of details help give us information that actually communicates the attributes of God. And that's part of the beauty of reading Scripture.
Yeah.
Great.
So I hope you enjoy it.
Have fun. See you next week.